Good afternoon. Guiding teams and shaping a portfolio using Wardley maps and DDD. So how are we today here in Malmö? Last day of the conference, nearly 2 o'clock. Rather tired perhaps? Sometimes I think we need to have like an adrenaline exchange program between the speaker and the audience at the end of a conference. All right. Why should you attend this talk? Organizations that lack situational awareness are going to be fighting themselves and ultimately will lose the battle in the market. So I think that you should use Wardley mapping to gain situational awareness, to improve your understanding of the market, and to devise strategies that will help you succeed. Now, if we have situational awareness, we'll likely realize that the value chain, as it currently is, needs to be evolved into a different state. And if we're in a software-driven organization, that means shifting the boundaries of some very rigid systems. And I'm convinced that domain-driven design can help you with discovering the intricacies of these value streams in these systems and then help you move these boundaries over time. So use domain-driven design to shift boundaries. Now, if you use domain-driven design and Wardley maps, then what you'll notice is if you do this effectively, you'll become anti-fragile to some extent, right? If you put stress on the organization will start to learn and it will start to adapt to the forces that we put on it. But what we need to make sure of is that we do that to the extent that the organization is able to handle. Anti-fragile does not mean unbreakable. And that's why I think we need portfolio management to constrain the work in progress that we're putting into the system of work in the organization. Talk to me at the end of this presentation if you're working in an organization with 5 teams or less. I think there will be some interesting concepts in this presentation for you. However, this is really targeted at people working in organizations that are larger than that, so 5 teams or more. I also want to invite you to talk to me at the end of this presentation if you want to have an in-depth conversation about any of these topics. I only have 40 minutes and I'm covering 3 major things, so obviously I'm just scratching the surface, right? It is a big picture story. And finally, if you don't know Wardley mapping or domain-driven design, then this talk may not be for you, right? So don't feel bad if you want to leave now. I totally understand. I will not be explaining these things in the basics. I'm really going to have a more advanced presentation here. So this is me. Oh no, well, that's how it's sometimes going to feel like. This is me. My name is Marijn Huizendveld, and I help leadership teams at scale-ups and other fast-growing organizations to accomplish more with the software that their teams build. What I usually tell my clients is I don't sell domain-driven design or workshops. I help you solve your problems. Now, over the course of the past 12 months, I have trained over 100 people in management and leadership positions about fostering an environment in which domain-driven design can come to fruition. And what I've noticed in doing this is something that I want to share with you today. All right, so why do we need Wardley mapping? So this is Pink Tie. This is a former business that I had in online ticketing. We would help theater organizers sell tickets to their events. And we had a big audacious goal as a company that I founded with 2 friends, 15 years ago. And our strategy was mostly driven by something that you all know, your underbelly. Right? And as a consequence of that, we had 3 founders and we had 3 underbellies. And these 3 underbellies were more than often not aligned with one another. And usually we'd have these conversations about strategy. And every time that we would sort of settle on an outcome, usually a few days later, the whole conversation would start all over again, and it would feel like we're in this perpetual hamster wheel of trying to figure out like where we're going as an organization. And a prime example of that was, is payments part of our core product, right? If you're selling tickets, right, we have to collect money on behalf of our merchants. So it's such an essential part of the of the service delivery process. We must consider this part of our strategic offering, right? And so we lack this mechanism to discuss strategy with the three of us. And as a consequence of that, we didn't really make it. So I remember, I know that at the time I was thinking, gosh, this must be better in grown-up organizations, right? Well, boy, was I in for a treat when I became a consultant after this failed startup. Obviously not. Because a lot of organizations actually lack a good strategy and an ability to communicate about it. And that's when I got acquainted with Wardley mapping. And Wardley mapping is really about developing situational awareness and then anticipating the changes in the environment and then finally playing in that environment and learning from that play. So let's look at that, right? Here you'll see a Wardley map of my former business in online ticketing, right? And when we have a map like this, we can talk about where we want to focus our attention, right? We can talk about doing something in close proximity to the user. So for example, ticketing, you'd say that the primary need of the ticket seller is to sell tickets, but really, as actually they want upfront money, right? They want to know where they're spending, if they're spending their marketing budget in the right place, right? Selling tickets is such a standardized thing. They can go there for they can go to any party for that. But it's these other needs where you can really differentiate. So we need to do stuff in the top part of the map, but obviously in the bottom part of the map, we might be constrained by things that we have designed in a particular way that are limiting us. Now, I feel that there is a lot of sort of talk in the Wardley mapping community about where you should focus, in the bottom part of the map or in the top part of the map. And I want to warn you for this false dichotomy, right? It is not one or the other. You just have to make sure that you have a balanced choice. Now, in this case, what the problem was and what situational awareness will make very apparent is that we were doing everything custom built, and that doesn't really work if you're a 3-person company with 1 FTE in tech capacity, right? And so this is why the business failed. Now, when you have situational awareness, you can start to anticipate the landscape, right? So for example, we can anticipate that over here, customer-friendly seat selection is something that is currently being custom built, but will become productized, and that we should probably adapt to that because our competitors are most likely also going to do that. And so if we do that, we can play, right? We can start to make a decision and we can say, okay, we are going to remove our homegrown solution and we're going to adopt something that is available in the market, because that allows us to focus in the long term more closely related to the user in things that really matter for them, such as upfront payout or data-driven marketing or whatever future needs we come up with. Now, when you start to do Wardley mapping and when you start to drive this situational awareness, there are many opportunities like this. But the problem is that you will not really get around to those because there will be a tremendous amount of self-harm in most organizations. There'll be so much going on that we first need to make the bleeding stop before we can really improve. And an example of that is various levels of friction, right? So first of all, there is this implicit accusation whenever you start to do Wardley mapping with an organization that actually they have no clue what their strategy is. Or if you point out what their strategy is in a Wardley map, you'll start to see that it doesn't make any sense. And so convincing and explaining people why you should be doing this and showing them that it's okay is actually a very challenging process in itself, right? A second problem is that there's often a lack of abstraction in the organization, which will make the mapping process itself very difficult, right? If nobody has ever really thought in conceptual abstractions, then people will start to reject this notion, right? Because it doesn't sort of translate directly one-on-one back into the components that the people are aware of, right? Wardley mapping is not about putting all of your microservices on there or your legacy systems. It's about finding the right conceptual level. And then there is this organizational preference that most organizations that I work with have, right? And that is, some organizations will say, well, we'll deal with the future stuff later. We'll just, make sure that we do whatever the customer wants right now. So that is an organization that has a real bias towards the top part of the map, right? Where if a customer says they want it, we'll build it, right? And they have no or little regard for their own future and how, and not paying any attention to the bottom part of the map is going to limit them in building stuff in the future. Now, there's other organizations that say, well, we'll first get the basis in order before we start to make any progress, right? And those are the organizations that will spend millions and decades solving problems in the bottom part of the map. And so these are real friction points that you will encounter when you work with an organization. And most of those friction really comes from the values that the organization has. So Wardley mapping really is all about producing situational awareness, anticipating change, and then based on your anticipation, making a play and learning from that play, and doing that in the smallest possible scale that you can imagine. Now, an organization without situational awareness will often be fighting with itself, right? And ultimately, it will be outplayed in the market. So I recommend to gain situational awareness with Wardley mapping. So why domain-driven design? So imagine a company and they have a software as a service product, right? And they offer this software as a service product in the form of a subscription. But besides this subscription, there's this thing that you can consume, right? By some unit of measure, right? And they're selling this, and they're selling this in various packages and subscription forms. Now, this organization just raised €100 million in funding, in growth funding, right? And so there are a bunch of venture capitalists that want them to roll out very aggressively in the European market. And that means they're going to hire a big team of growth hackers and smart marketeers to figure out in each of these prospective markets what pricing works, right? But this organization made a mistake a few years ago, and they built their own homegrown billing and subscription management system. And so the CTO and the CFO are in the board, and they decide together that, yes, of course, it's not really the core differentiator of the platform, and therefore they're going to buy a product. And that product is going to allow the people in the finance team and the growth hackers and the marketeers to figure out the right pricing and to make sure that all of the administration around that is automated. But obviously, it needs to be connected to the product itself, right, in how it gets used. And so they buy this product, right? But now the tech team says, yes, we're doing domain-driven design. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we protect ourselves from the possibility of this platform ever going bankrupt, right? So we're going to build our own domain model to deal with subscription billing and management, and we're going to translate using an anti-corruption layer to that platform that they've bought. Do you start to see where this is going wrong? What is happening here is we're limiting ourselves by adopting this product, right? And conforming to all of the value that this product in subscription billing management has to offer to growth hackers that can just sort of like click together a new particular price offering. And as a consequence of that, people in the growth hacking department and the marketeers and in finance have to go back to the development team every time a new feature gets rolled out in that platform. So they'll never really get the benefit of that. So this is a real story, right? And it's because people sometimes mistake domain-driven design for perfectionism, right? They think, all right, I have to devise a model and I have to model it in the most perfect way, and I have to isolate myself from various systems, and I need to be able to replace things. But it's not about that, right? It is about making sure that you grasp the domain and do that in collaboration with stakeholders, and that you leverage the models that you come up with, and then finally that you implement those models where it matters with a level of technical excellence that will make it easy to evolve these systems over time. So what does that look like, that collaborative modeling? Well, we can do something like event storming, right? Where we're grasping the bigger picture of how we're delivering value in that process. And we want to leverage that model in various phases, right? We can say what type of behavior the system offers, right? What things we can tell the system, what events happen in it, who's responsible for doing it. We can ask ourselves what are the questions that the business is asking to the system and model those things explicitly. We can explore various alternatives using something like a boundless context canvas, where rather than falling victim to the very first idea that we have, we explore various options. And then once we have all the options on the table, we start to talk about the trade-offs between all of these options, right? And if we do that well, then we can dive into another level of depth, right? Where we're doing some example mapping and make sure that we know which scenarios we want to support and which we don't really care about. And then finally, when we're ready for coding, right, we can really focus on the technical excellence. And we can make sure that we capture these things in tests, that we make sure that these tests pass, and that we refactor up until the point where we feel that this is a really accurate representation of the model. So that whenever we're having a conversation with the domain expert about what we're trying to change in the system, we won't have the "that's not how it works in the code" conversation, because the models, the concepts that we have modeled are not represented in the code system. So the goal of all of that is to iterate, to discard, and to experiment, right? And one of the ways to do that is by using this modeling whirlpool. So DDD is all about preventing the "that's not how it works in the code" conversation from ever taking place. But there's some friction with that, because what you'll often see is if you start to apply domain-driven design in an area of the business where you think, here we can make the difference, but the organization has never really spent any time trying to do a good separation of concerns throughout the ecosystem, then what's going to happen is there's going to be all of these dependencies on other parts of the organization, and you're effectively going to have a shifting bottleneck, right? Where first the problem seemed to be over here, but once you start to work on it, you start to realize that the real problem is over there. And the reason for this is that domain-driven design is a holistic approach, right? And if you do a partial application of an holistic approach, then what you effectively have is an oxymoron, right? So this gets really painful, right? You want to start small on one hand, but on the other hand, as soon as you start small, you might realize that the problem is not in the area where you started. And that is friction. Now, a lot of people in the organization have seen it all, right? They've shown the promised land before, right? People came by with other technologies or techniques or patterns and principles that might solve us and alleviate some of these pressures, right? And so it's sometimes very challenging to really get the level of buy-in. And then finally, if we're doing all of these things, it's not just starting it, but it's also finishing it, right? So a lot of organizations at the end of the day, they'll fail to bring up the discipline, right, to make sure that if we make a small change, right, if we put something in between somewhere, to clean up the last bits after it. And as a consequence of that, the ecosystem that we have keeps on growing and growing and growing up until the point where you look at a legacy system and there's a box drawn next to it and you ask, what's that? Oh yeah, that would be the legacy's legacy. So domain-driven design is all about collaborative modeling, right? Figuring out what the domain is all about, leveraging that model everywhere, and not just in code, but in the documentation, in the conversations, and sometimes even in your marketing proposition. And then figuring out where we need to really focus on technical excellence to implement these things, so that whenever we have new realizations, we can truly reach the potential that we have because the system is working for us rather than against us. So if our value chains need to evolve, then practices are needed to help shift the boundaries of rigid systems, and you can discover and move boundaries with domain-driven design. All right. So why do we need portfolio management? Imagine that you're working for an organization and you're part of a team, right? And this team is tasked to pave a new road, right? You're going to work with new architectural principles and practices. You're going to lead the way, right? You're going to show that it can be done differently. But you're not the only team who's tasked with that, right? There is another team working on a legacy system, and they need to start to really regain control over that system. Now, what might happen is we might have a situation where there's this dependency between these two different initiatives, right? And as a consequence of that, the team that is working on paving this new road is actually really unable to make progress the way it wants to, because the team that is working on the legacy system has called a complete halt of any changes in the legacy system in order to just first start to really get control over this. This is an example of failing to understand what the dependencies are within your landscape and how they influence one another. And if you were to have a map and look at the dependencies between these things, that will help you understand whether or not you're setting up teams for success. So portfolio management and doing that well, I think, is all about that. And in the context of doing this with domain-driven design and Wardley maps, I want to talk about three things: about 9 allies, about how you can leverage existing processes, and why you maybe should never do something. So let's talk about 9 allies. So I was working with a manager, and he said, yeah, we have a vision. And it was true. They had a real strategy. But the operational plan is missing. And it kind of made me laugh a bit, if I'm honest. Because it seemed that this person failed to understand that making an operational plan was actually part of their job. And that made me realize that if you're working in an organization and you're trying to sell them on these ideas, right? On domain-driven design, on Wardley mapping, and why you need to be doing them. What you need is, you need to have allies in business, right? You need to have people that understand the market and understand it well. You need to have people in product, right? That are able to say, all right, I understand what the problem is that we're trying to solve in the market, but here's a specific vision on how we're going to achieve that, right? And we need people in engineering that really understand all of the intricacies that go into building a beautiful product, right? But on the other hand, we need these people on 3 different layers, right? We need them in leadership positions, right? Higher management. And we need them in management, right? Everything in between that and the team. And we need them within the team itself, right? So think of the product owner, the business owner, and software engineer. So 9 allies. Now, don't expect to score your bingo card completely, right? I don't expect you to have all 9 allies. But once you think of the structure of 9 allies, you can ask yourself, all right, I see different ways of accomplishing the goals. Given the people that I have to my availability, which of these strategies is most likely to succeed, given the level of sponsorship that I can get in the team, in the leadership team, and in the management level? All right, so that's 9 allies. Leveraging process. So when you start to introduce these things, right, what I quite often hear is, oh my God, yet another thing we have to do on top of agile, OKRs, a 360 review, etc., 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 blah, blah, blah. And it's true, right? Most organizations are completely over-asked in terms of like what we have to do. And so what I want to recommend is, do not yet turn this into yet another thing, right? But rather look at what existing practices and moments are already existing within the existing way of working that we can leverage in order to do some of these things, right? What is a time in a typical cycle of a year where I could do Wardley mapping with senior management, right? What is a time where with the team I could do a little bit of event storming? What is a time where together with various enterprise architects we could look at a context map or do some bounded context canvassing? Looking at existing moments in time within the process will really help you drive adoption and remove this sort of, oh my God, yet another thing to do fear. So if we're building up this portfolio in a larger organization, right? What you'll typically see a lot is here is the roadmap for the rest of the year, and here's the roadmap for the 2 years following it, right? And it's completely filled with all the slots, right? So if DDD is a holistic approach, then why not tear off the Band-Aid all at once? So here is an example event storming artifact from a realistic project. I'll have some real time to sip my water because I wanted to show you something real. I think we're not even halfway. And mind you, this is from a part of an organization that is like, this constitutes not even 20% of the full organization. And you see all those red sticky notes? Those are all questions and problems that we have. So now imagine that you're a product manager, right? Or someone else responsible for the portfolio process. And you already think about your completely filled up roadmap for the next 3 years. Are you going to get very excited about everything that we just uncovered? You probably get fairly stressed, right? There's all of these things that we still have to do. And the same applies here. This is an example of a Wardley map, right? See all those red stickies? Oh my God, we just looked at it from a different angle and we just see even more stuff, right? And we're wondering, like, when are we ever going to do this, right? And we also know that just adding more capacity, right, throwing more money on the problem, that's not going to improve it, right? Because that just, we cannot make a baby in 3 months with 3 people instead of 9 months with 1. And so what we need is an honest roadmap, right? Where rather than filling this thing up for the next 3 years, we just want to talk about what we are doing right now, what we're going to be doing straight after this, and what we'll be doing maybe later. Or perhaps you shouldn't even be calling this category maybe later, but maybe never, to really articulate that some of these things that we're putting on that backlog are not necessarily things that we'll be doing, right? Because we all know that backlogs are places where ideas go to die. So maybe never. So sometimes when you start to introduce all of these ideas, this weird notion starts to creep up to people. It's like, well, we're going to be doing domain-driven design or Wardley mapping or whatever, and then all of our problems will go away, right? We'll understand our landscape, and then it will all be easy. This is sort of like the dreams, and this is then reality. And I mean, it is not like you couldn't possibly get towards your dreams, right? But this is not going to happen on day one, right? You have to build up slowly, right? If you immediately start to do this level of weightlifting with your organization, you're definitely going to be this person, right? And so we have to figure out as an organization to what extent we're able to carry on a particular load, right? This is the organizational equivalent. Doing all of this is the organizational equivalent of going to the gym. It is not going to be fun at first, right? Because we haven't been practicing it at all, right? There isn't an easy 3-step guide to getting healthy, right? You cannot, like, if you take the gym analogy, right? You wouldn't go to the gym and then go there once and expect that you're fully healthy, right? And just as that, you cannot go and do one Wardley mapping session and then, oh, we understand the ecosystem and we'll be able to change the market forever, right? Or we'll do some event storming and then we understand our value stream and then we'll just do a bit of refactoring and we're done, right? It is an ongoing process, and the more you do it, the better you will get at it. And the more you do it, the more load you can take on, right? And as a consequence of that, this stuff really starts to pay off then when the heat is on, right? It starts to pay off when all of a sudden your market conditions change dramatically, and you have been practicing these things, right? Because by that time, you are actually able to withstand that load, and you're like that weightlifter, right? You don't have to be the person who's then deciding, okay, I maybe should go to the gym. So it's going to make you anti-fragile, right? But the problem with that is you are not unbreakable, right? If you are doing too many things, like in the example before, where we have two teams trying to work on something, one team paving the new way and the other one trying to get control over a legacy system. If we're connecting that without an understanding, then we're going to overload the organization, we're going to over-ask some of the key experts, and as a consequence of that, the stuff is going to break down tremendously. So there's some friction with all of this, and that is there can be some organizations, you'll have teams with a high perceived autonomy, right? We'll start to give them a clear goal, right? Because we've done some Wardley mapping, we'll give them many techniques to do implementation, etc. And then at some point in time, they might start to perceive a level of autonomy that is too high, right? When we're saying we want autonomous teams, it doesn't mean that everybody gets to do whatever they want, right? So we do need to ensure that we have some guardrails in place that will help teams thrive and that will help us ensure that we have consistent quality over the organization. There can be this friction with your portfolio process where if you're going to put that portfolio process at the cadence of the organization, for example, quarters or whatever way you separated the year, then that might produce friction if you're working at a slow, you're able to solve this problem in a faster or slower pace. And so rather than doing that, what we want to be doing is working on the next big thing, right? So really going pull-based from our backlog. And another thing is, if we start to do this portfolio management process, what you'll see is, especially at the middle management layer, if we're starting to introduce this in an organization where things aren't great, a lot of these people have to haggle with one another quite often, right? They need to get stuff done, and they have requests from their other peers. And as a consequence of that, a lot of these people will hold the cards very close to their chest. But if we're in that situation, right, it's going to be very difficult to make real progress towards improving the landscape. So if we have a portfolio of products, right, what I recommend you to do is to think about, like, what allies do I have and what does that mean for what we can accomplish? Leverage existing processes in order to not overload the organization with a tremendous amount of work, and to make sure that we manage our roadmap in such a way that we are allowing ourselves to say, maybe never. All right. So Wardley mapping and domain-driven design make organizations more anti-fragile, but not unbreakable. So constrain your work in progress. So some final words. In this book, at the end of the book, Eric Evans talks about sort of how some of the projects played out that are mentioned in the book, right? And not all of these projects are tremendous successes, right? And that's going to be the same for you, right? You're here at a conference, and maybe you're excited about some of the stuff that you've heard today in this talk or in any of the other talks, right? But your excitement about it and perhaps the potential fit with the situation that your organization is in is not going to be enough to succeed with these things, right? Think of the gym, right? In order to be successful, right, you have to start to practice them little by little. And there's going to be some friction in it if it's a holistic approach like domain-driven design, because you actually need to do it quite a bit larger in order to get to the full value. So what should you do? My advice to you, do go Wardley map to gain situational awareness, right? Use some of the patterns, principles, and practices from domain-driven design to discover the boundaries of your software systems and to shift them whenever it's needed. And use a portfolio management process, right, to constrain the work in progress to ensure that you're not overloading your organization. Now, if you're interested in learning more, here are some references. I'll share the slides later and there's links in them to learn more about some of the topics that I mentioned. And if you like this presentation, then tell your friends, tell your boss, and tell the internet. And if you want to reach out, here's my contact details. I wish you a very pleasant last afternoon at the conference. And I also wish you a very happy return home.